In the spring of 1839, in Burke County, Georgia, something happened that exposed the strange and troubling ways that power operated in slaveholding households. A plantation mistress named Louisa Pemberton, a daily ritual that blurred boundaries everyone else kept rigid, and a scandal that revealed how absolute power could manifest in ways that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. If stories about power's corrupting influence matter to you, about how the complete control slavery granted could twist into bizarre forms of domination, then stay with me. Because what happened at Pemberton Hall between 1837 and 1839 tells you everything you need to know about how slavery enabled not just cruelty, but psychological domination that reduced people to objects in ways both violent and strange. The year 1837 sits in the middle of Georgia's cotton prosperity. Burke County, in the eastern part of the state, was wealthy plantation country. Enslaved people outnumbered white people significantly, creating constant anxiety among slaveholders about maintaining control through a combination of violence, surveillance, and psychological domination. Louisa Pemberton was born Louisa Ashford in 1805 in Savannah, daughter of a wealthy merchant family. She married Thomas Pemberton in 1825, when she was 20 and he was 42. It was a good match by social standards. Thomas owned Pemberton Hall, a 3,500-acre plantation with 90 enslaved people, one of the largest estates in Burke County. The marriage was strange from the beginning. Thomas was much older than Louisa, often away on business, and when present, largely indifferent to his young wife. He'd married primarily to secure an heir and to have someone manage his household while he focused on cotton production and land speculation. Louisa found herself at 25 years old, married to a man who barely noticed her, living on an isolated plantation with no children despite 10 years of marriage. She had enormous power over the household enslaved people, but few outlets for her intelligence or energy. By 1837, Louisa had developed what she called her morning ritual, something that started innocently, but evolved into something much stranger and more troubling. Pemberton Hall had a bathing room, a luxury at the time, fed by a cistern that provided water for a large copper tub. Most plantation families bathed weekly at most, but Louisa had developed a habit of bathing daily, considering it essential for health and refinement. What made Louisa's bathing unusual was that she never bathed alone. She required enslaved women from the household to be present, not just to help her bathe, which would have been normal for a wealthy woman, but to bathe with her. The ritual worked like this. Every morning around 8 o'clock, after Thomas left to oversee field operations, Louisa would summon 3 or 4 enslaved women to the bathing room. The women would fill the large tub with warm water. Then Louisa would undress and enter the tub, and she'd require the women to undress and enter with her. The stated purpose was cleanliness and inspection. Louisa claimed she needed to ensure the household women were clean, that she was teaching them proper hygiene, that communal bathing was healthy and promoted household harmony. But what actually happened in that bathing room was about power, control, and a form of domination that reduced enslaved women to objects for Louisa's psychological manipulation. The women who participated in these bathing sessions, there were about 8 women who rotated through, experienced it as deeply humiliating and invasive. They were required to strip naked in front of their mistress, to enter the tub with her, to allow her to touch them ostensibly for cleaning, but in ways that felt violating. Louisa would examine their bodies, make comments about their physical characteristics, compare them to each other and to herself. She'd discuss their value as property, their suitability for different kinds of work, their attractiveness or lack thereof. She treated them like livestock being evaluated, like objects whose only purpose was to be studied and controlled. One of the women required to participate was named Clara. She was 23 years old in 1837, had been born at Pemberton Hall, worked as a lady's maid. In later testimony, Clara described what the bathing sessions felt like. Mistress Louisa would have us all get in the tub with her. She'd touch us, look at us, talk about our bodies like we wasn't even people. She'd say things like, "This one has good breeding hips," or "This one's skin is too dark to be worth much." She'd make us wash her, then she'd wash us. And the whole time she'd be talking about us like we was horses or cows. Another woman, named Hannah, described the psychological impact. It made you feel like you wasn't human, like you was just a thing for her to look at and touch and talk about. You couldn't say no. She owned you. You couldn't cover yourself. She'd get angry if you showed modesty. You just had to stand there naked while she studied you like you was livestock. The bathing ritual served multiple purposes for Louisa. It reinforced her power. She could force these women to be naked and vulnerable in her presence, demonstrating her complete control over their bodies. It satisfied some psychological need to examine and categorize the women she owned, and it filled the empty hours of her isolated, unsatisfying life with a ritual that gave her a sense of purpose and power. For the enslaved women, it was another form of violence. Not the physical brutality of whipping or field labor, but a psychological violation that stripped away dignity and autonomy, that reinforced that their bodies weren't their own. The ritual continued for nearly 2 years without anyone outside Pemberton Hall knowing about it. The enslaved women who participated couldn't speak about it to white people. Their testimony meant nothing legally, and complaining would just bring punishment. The other enslaved people at Pemberton Hall knew something strange was happening, but not the full details. Thomas Pemberton was completely unaware. He left the household management entirely to Louisa, never questioned what she did with her mornings, trusted her to manage the domestic enslaved people, however she saw fit. The scandal broke in February 1839, when one of the enslaved women involved tried to run away. Her name was Rachel, age 19, who'd been participating in the bathing ritual for about a year. The psychological toll had become unbearable. Rachel felt dehumanized, violated, trapped in a situation where every morning she was forced to be naked and vulnerable while Louisa examined and discussed her body. Rachel ran away in early February 1839. She was caught within 2 days. There was nowhere for enslaved people to run in rural Georgia, no realistic hope of reaching free territory. She was brought back to Pemberton Hall in chains. Thomas Pemberton was furious. Running away was one of the most serious offenses an enslaved person could commit. He demanded to know why Rachel had run, what had driven her to take such a desperate action. Rachel, facing certain brutal punishment anyway, decided to tell the truth. She described the bathing ritual in detail, how Louisa forced women to bathe with her, how she examined their bodies, how she talked about them like livestock, how it made them feel violated and dehumanized. Thomas was shocked. He initially didn't believe Rachel. The idea that his wife was engaging in such bizarre behavior seemed impossible. But Rachel provided specific details about the bathing room, about what Louisa said and did, details she couldn't have known unless she'd actually been present. Thomas confronted Louisa. She initially denied everything, claimed Rachel was lying to avoid punishment for running away. But Thomas questioned the other women who'd participated. One by one, they confirmed Rachel's account. The bathing ritual was real. Thomas was faced with a dilemma. What his wife had been doing wasn't illegal. Enslaved people had no legal protection from this kind of treatment. But it was deeply strange. The kind of behavior that would make Pemberton Hall the subject of gossip and speculation if it became public. Thomas decided to handle it quietly. He would end the bathing ritual, would prohibit Louisa from continuing it, but would not make the situation public. Rachel would still be punished for running away, can't let that go unpunished, but the underlying reason would remain secret. Rachel received 20 lashes. Thomas made sure the whipping happened away from the main house, kept the number of witnesses minimal. Then he sold her to a trader, heading to Mississippi, getting her away from Pemberton Hall, so she couldn't spread stories about what had happened. Thomas spoke to Louisa privately. The conversation was never recorded, but its outcome was clear. The bathing ritual ended immediately. Louisa would no longer require enslaved women to bathe with her. She would return to more conventional bathing practices. Louisa apparently argued that what she'd been doing was reasonable, teaching cleanliness, maintaining household order, exercising her rightful authority over enslaved property. Thomas reportedly responded that it didn't matter whether it was reasonable. It was strange enough to cause problems if it became public knowledge. The ritual ended, but the story didn't. Despite Thomas's attempts to keep everything quiet, stories spread. The enslaved community at Pemberton Hall knew what had happened. They told enslaved people on neighboring plantations. The story spread through Burke County's enslaved community, passed along through the informal networks that enslaved people used to share information. Eventually, fragments of the story reached white ears. Other plantation owners heard rumors about strange goings-on at Pemberton Hall, about Louisa Pemberton doing something inappropriate with enslaved women. The rumors were vague enough that nobody knew exactly what had happened, but specific enough to damage the Pembertons' social standing. Invitations to social events became less frequent. Business associates were more distant. The Pemberton family found themselves somewhat isolated from Burke County society. Thomas blamed Louisa for the social damage. Their marriage, already cold, became openly hostile. Thomas spent more time away from Pemberton Hall, leaving Louisa increasingly isolated. Louisa, deprived of her morning ritual and increasingly ostracized socially, became depressed and erratic. She still managed the household, but without the energy or engagement she'd shown before. The enslaved women who'd participated in the bathing ritual noticed the change. Louisa seemed diminished, purposeless without her bizarre daily routine. In 1841, Thomas died suddenly of what was probably a heart attack. He was 58 years old. His death left Louisa as owner of Pemberton Hall and its 90 enslaved people. One might expect that Louisa, now in complete control without a husband to prohibit her behavior, would resume the bathing ritual. But she didn't. Perhaps Thomas's condemnation had shamed her. Perhaps the social damage had made her recognize that what she'd been doing was wrong. Or perhaps she'd only engaged in the ritual as a response to her powerless position in her marriage. And now that she had real authority, she no longer needed that particular form of domination. Louisa managed Pemberton Hall for 5 years after Thomas's death. She hired an overseer to manage field operations, but maintained control over household affairs. She never remarried, lived relatively quietly, and by all accounts treated the enslaved people at Pemberton Hall no worse than other plantation owners of the time. Which is to say, she still owned them and profited from their labor, but without the particular psychological violation of the bathing ritual. Louisa died in 1846, at age 41, from complications of tuberculosis. Her estate, including the enslaved people at Pemberton Hall, was inherited by Thomas's nephew, who moved to the plantation and continued operating it until the Civil War. The story of the bathing ritual became part of the oral history of Burke County's black community. Elderly people interviewed in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers' Project still remembered hearing about the mistress who made women bathe with her, though details had become murky with time. What makes Louisa Pemberton's story significant isn't just its strangeness, though it is strange, but what it reveals about how slavery enabled psychological domination alongside physical cruelty. Louisa wasn't whipping these women. She wasn't working them to death in fields. She was forcing them into a ritual that served no economic purpose, that existed purely to satisfy her psychological need to examine, categorize, and control the bodies of women she owned. This was possible because slavery gave owners absolute legal power over enslaved people's bodies. Louisa could force women to be naked in her presence, could touch them, could examine them, could discuss their bodies however she wanted. The women had no recourse, no protection, no ability to refuse. The violation wasn't physical in the conventional sense. There's no evidence the bathing ritual involved sexual assault. But it was profoundly violating nonetheless. It stripped away dignity, autonomy, privacy. It reduced women to objects to be studied and discussed, reinforcing daily that their bodies weren't their own. Clara, one of the women who participated, was interviewed years later and asked what the worst part of the bathing ritual was. Her answer was revealing. The worst part was knowing she could do it. That she had the power to make you strip naked and get in a tub with her while she looked at you like you was livestock, and you couldn't do nothing about it. That's what slavery was, knowing somebody could do anything to you, and you couldn't stop them. The bathing ritual also reveals something about Louisa herself. She was trapped in a loveless marriage, isolated on a plantation, with enormous power over enslaved people, but limited power in her own life. The ritual gave her a sense of control, a daily reinforcement that she had power over something, even if that something was just the bodies of vulnerable women. This doesn't excuse what she did. Having limited power in your own life doesn't justify exercising absolute power over others in degrading ways. But it does illustrate how slavery corrupted everyone involved, how it enabled people to express their own frustrations and psychological needs through domination of the powerless. The story also shows how slavery's abuses weren't always the spectacular cruelties that made headlines. Sometimes they were daily rituals, bizarre exercises of power, psychological violations that left no physical scars, but damaged people's sense of self and dignity. For the women who participated in Louisa's bathing ritual, the experience was traumatic in ways that lasted long after the ritual ended. Hannah, interviewed in old age, described still feeling violated when she thought about it. Even now, 70 years later, I remember standing naked while that woman looked at me and talked about me like I wasn't human. That feeling don't ever quite go away. The scandal surrounding Louisa's behavior also reveals something about how Southern society policed even slaveholders' behavior, not out of concern for enslaved people, but out of concern for social order and reputation. Thomas Pemberton didn't end the bathing ritual because he thought it was wrong to treat enslaved women that way. He ended it because it was strange enough to damage the family's reputation if it became public. This highlights a disturbing reality. Southern society was comfortable with extraordinary brutality toward enslaved people, whipping, family separation, sexual assault, but became uncomfortable when slaveholders behaved in ways that seemed bizarre or excessive by their own standards. The bar for what counted as excessive was horrifyingly high. The fact that Louisa's behavior was considered scandalous, while routine whipping, sexual assault, and family separation were considered normal shows how deeply slavery had corrupted Southern moral standards. The ritual humiliation of forced communal bathing was shocking. The daily violence of slavery was just business as usual. Today, there's no marker at the site of Pemberton Hall. The house burned during the Civil War, and the land was eventually subdivided. Nothing remains to indicate what happened there between 1837 and 1839. But the story survives in oral histories, in the testimonies of enslaved people interviewed decades later, in the scandalous whispers that were passed down through generations. The mistress who bathed with her slaves every morning, who forced them to be naked and vulnerable while she examined them like livestock, who exercised power in ways that were bizarre even to other slaveholders. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in Georgia in the 1830s, involving a plantation mistress who had enormous power and used it to dominate women psychologically in ways that served no purpose except to satisfy her own needs. Remember that the women who experienced this ritual felt violated and dehumanized, that it added another layer of trauma to the already traumatic experience of being enslaved. Remember that this kind of psychological domination was possible because slavery gave owners absolute legal power over enslaved people's bodies, allowing them to use those bodies however they wanted, including in ways that served no economic purpose, but purely psychological ones. Remember that even other slaveholders found this behavior strange, but they objected to it as scandal rather than as cruelty, as something that damaged reputation rather than something that damaged human beings. This is part of slavery's legacy, not just the physical brutality, but the psychological violations, the bizarre exercises of power, the ways that absolute authority corrupted and twisted into forms of domination that reduced people to objects for examination and control. The plantation mistress who bathed with her slaves every morning, a scandal that Georgia's elite wanted hidden, a violation that was psychological rather than physical, but devastating nonetheless. It's part of our history, uncomfortable, strange, revealing the many forms that slavery's cruelty could take. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Louisa Pemberton's actions? Was the forced bathing ritual a form of assault, even though it apparently didn't involve sexual contact? Does the fact that Louisa herself was trapped in an unhappy, powerless marriage provide any context for understanding, though not excusing, her need to dominate others? How do we categorize violations that are primarily psychological rather than physical? These questions challenge us to think about power's many forms. Louisa didn't whip these women or work them to death, but she forced them into daily rituals of nakedness and vulnerability, examined their bodies, discussed them like livestock, stripped away their dignity and privacy. Is psychological violation less serious than physical violence? The women who experienced it didn't think so. They described feeling dehumanized, reduced to objects, violated in ways that lasted for decades. The forced intimacy and examination served no purpose except to satisfy Louisa's psychological need for control. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that explore slavery's psychological dimensions alongside its physical cruelties. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, acknowledging that slavery's violations took many forms, some physical, some psychological, all devastating to the people who experienced them. This story forces us to confront how absolute power enabled not just brutality, but bizarre exercises of domination that treated people as objects for study and control. See you in the next video.